Hello, welcome to Helicopter Training Videos. In this video we're going to talk about the new Helicopter Airmen Certificate Standards, otherwise known as the ACS, that are replacing the old Practical Test Standards, or the PTS. Yes, the Helicopter ACS is finally here. But, like buses, you wait and then 4 turn up at once. So first of all, obviously, if you're not a pilot under the FAA system, you can probably skip these ACS videos. But if you're a student pilot or an instructor or even a rated pilot who might one day need a instrument proficiency check or a flight review, these changes will affect you. Second thing, obviously this is not the most fun topic to cover, but it's important, and so I want to make sure we go through this properly with you. So what is the ACS? The ACS is the Airmen Certificate Standards that is basically an enhanced version of the old PTS or Practical Test Standards. And the ACS is probably new to most FAA helicopter pilots, so we'll go through some history of it, the goals, some basic differences or general differences of ACS versus PTS, including the task structure, the coding system, required elements, the overall ACS document organization, as well as special emphasis areas and ADM, the new technologies that it's embracing, updated references, and additional rating table changes. Also coming up soon will be deep dive videos, which will go into each of those ratings into more detail. We're just kind of doing with more of the general stuff here today. I also have some tips for students, and I'll also have some links for more information. All of these should be chapters that you can jump ahead to if you're watching this on YouTube. So first of all, the history. In 2011, the project was started to fix the knowledge tests, which were seen as out of step with real pilot needs. But they quickly realized that both the knowledge and the practical tests would need to be overhauled. So they took in industry and public comments and started prototyping and testing the ACS at a couple of flight schools in Orlando and Seattle. And in 2016, the first ACS for the fixed-wing private pilot was released. That was followed by an instrument ACS, a commercial, and an ATP. They also worked on a remote pilot and mechanic ACS. In 2018, they started work on the helicopter ACS, and here we are, April 2024, and they released the private pilot, commercial, instrument, and CFI helicopter ACS with an effective date of May 31st, 2024. They also were quite busy. They are releasing powered lift ACS as well as updating airplane ACS and adding a new CFI ACS for the airplane side. They're also creating a gyroplane-only PTS. When can you start working on using the ACS? Well, according to the FAA's Notice 8900.691, it says that you can start using the ACS for check rides right now if both the DPE or the examiner and the applicant agree. Another question that we're going to get is, what about if I take my check ride under the PTS on, say, May 25th, and I have some sort of disapproval or failure? When I retake the check ride to finish that up, will I be using the PTS or the ACS? Well, the guidance is that you have 60 days from the initial attempt to take the redo, and if you take the redo within that 60 days, then you'll be on the PTS that you started the test with. So effectively, the last people that will ever be able to use the private commercial instrument or CFI PTS will be those that may have a chance to do it up to 60 days after May 31st. But for most people, come May 31st, and that is May 31st, not June 1st, there will be the switch over to the ACS. What were the goals then of ACS? Well, they were to combine the required pilot standards into what pilots should know, what they should consider, and what they should do. And we'll come back to those phrases. And that's to apply to both the knowledge and the practical tests and all the supporting references, handbooks, etc. They want to incorporate special emphasis areas and risk management and ADM topics into the specific practical test elements, eliminate the bloat in the PTS, and to standardize content across the ACS. Move a lot of the lengthy PTS intro material and task notes into standardized ACS appendices and new ACS companion guide for pilots, which is a separate document. We'll talk about that shortly. They want to create this system to link and update and review standards with regulations, guidance, and handbooks, and update the knowledge test questions and report codes. So they've already started doing that, removing old questions about things like ADS and NDBs, etc. The other thing is that they wanted to create this as a single source for both practical and knowledge test standards with this new coding system. So it effectively combines content from 4 other documents, which would have been the PTS, the knowledge test guide, the learning statement reference guide, and the knowledge exam testing matrix. So it also reduces chance of conflicting information, stuff getting out of date between those different documents. So how does a task differ from the PTS to the ACS, the actual task itself? Well, first of all, there'll be updated references, they'll be moving lengthy notes into the appendices, and they'll be adding task-specific knowledge items and risk management elements. The skill elements, which are the pieces that have changed the least, they're still going to be updated, and there'll be a lot more detail about what you are expected to do. The code system, which we'll cover later, that's a big change. So this is the private helicopter ACS for Area of Operation 7, navigation, Task C, diversion. So you can we still have area of operations and tasks. And then you can see this is new, the way they broke this down. Now we have a area of knowledge, risk management, and skills. And that goes back to what we were saying about an area of what you need to know, what you should be considering, and what you need to do for each one of the tasks. Knowledge tests will mainly be using items from the know section or the knowledge section, but can also be using sections from the consider and even from the skills, because if it says something like calculate or determine, those elements could appear in a knowledge test or written test. You can see here straight away that there's more content. We're comparing the old practical test standard for the helicopter private pilot Task C diversion with the new ACS version of it. It's obviously more content, it's spread out a little bit more. There's more references at the top. There's more content, and that means actually there's more guidance, not necessarily that there's more to learn. It's kind of helping you understand exactly what you may be asked here. Now, many of the practical test standards tasks started with exhibits knowledge of the elements related to, and then it would say, for example, diversions. Well, that's obviously very vague. So one of the things that they have done is they've broken that down into individual elements related to the task. You can see here there's 2 elements, but there could be many more. Next we have the skill section that you can see, the skill section in the practical test standards. That translates over pretty close to what's going to be in the ACS. You can see here there's an extra piece, but they're quite similar. The old PTS had special emphasis area topics and vague ADM requirements, and now those have been taken away from, there's no special emphasis areas anymore. It's all been incorporated into actual task-specific risk management and skill elements. So you can see here that the old PTS was printed on a 4x6 page. Because there's so much more content, the new ACS is printed on a full letter size 8.5 times 11 inch. Even so, it's still twice as big almost as the PTS. And I want to remind you, that does not mean that it's going to be a longer check ride. It's actually, we'll talk about this in a minute, but it's actually potential for a quicker check ride. But it does mean a lot more guidance. One of the key parts to the ACS change is the coding system. And to start with, it looks confusing, but you'll very quickly get the hang of this. The coding system brings together knowledge tests and practical test standards, and it replaces the old PLT codes that you would get on your knowledge test report. It has specific elements to help identify the areas of weakness that you need to study on and train on. And it also identifies the elements that you as a student would, or an applicant, would be assessed on in the practical test. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. Now there's no need to go look up the code in a separate document, which would have been the learning statement reference guide. It's all in the ACS here. So knowledge test questions are also being reviewed and revised and coded to be switched over to the new ACS system. I've sent some emails out to the FAA, and luckily just before I finished editing this video I got a reply, and this was from the FAA Testing Standards section AFS 810. They said yes, the rotorcraft helicopter private instrument and commercial and flight instructor airman knowledge test banks have been updated. These test banks will become active on May 31st, 2024, and the ACS codes will replace the learning statement codes or PLT codes on May 31st, 2024. This will also help the FAA align all the standards with handbooks, ACS, and test questions. So here we have an example of an old PLT code from a helicopter instrument knowledge test. So you miss a few questions, and on the report you get these codes, these PLT codes that tell you the areas you need to work on and you need to be trained on and get an endorsement on before you go take your practical test. Well, here's a really good example of how vague those can be. PLT 415, when you look that up, it says you missed a question on regulations IFR flying. Again, that's very vague. Here we're going to look at the new ACS system. So on the knowledge tests, once they switch over, you'll see these ACS codes. And here for private pilot, it would say something like, you can see down the bottom, a single code may represent more than one incorrect response. It'll give you a list. Let's break down these codes so you can understand how to read these. So ph.viii.e.k5. What on earth does that mean? The first part is which ACS. So PH is private helicopter. The next section is the area of operation, in this case the emergency operations. Then the task, E, which is vortex ring state. That's right, you read vortex ring state, not settling with power. Seeing some progress here already. And then K5 is a knowledge element, the fifth knowledge element, which is the flight scenarios under which vortex ring state can occur. It could have been an R for a risk element or an S for a skill element. We also have sub-elements. So some of these elements are broken down into sub-elements. They carry the same weight in terms of having to complete one element. A sub-element will count as a full element. So here we have the K1 Bravo, and we'll walk through there. It's basically anti-torque system failure task. K1 Bravo is the difference between complete loss of anti-torque and mechanical flight control failures. So that would be maybe the difference between loss of the tail rotor blades versus a stuck pedal, perhaps. And so you can see how it reads out here. Elements relating to anti-torque system failure by describing, and then it has a bunch of different options, and this one is the Bravo that we just talked about. So what do we actually have to do for each task? What are the required elements? Luckily, Appendix 1 will tell us that, and it says for each task, at least one knowledge element, one risk element, all the skill elements, and all the ACS codes missed in the knowledge test report. So a higher knowledge score is going to mean that you have less elements potentially to cover, which can lead to a potentially shorter ground. It's always been important that you do well in your knowledge test, but even more so now. You could walk out with 100% or a very high 90. You're going to have a lot less of these required extra elements. And it also, the way that the changes are being done on the knowledge test, the DPEs or the examiners are having more confidence in the results, which can make the practical tests more efficient. They don't have to dig so deep. But it also says in the Appendix 1 that the evaluator has the discretion to sample as needed to ensure the applicant's mastery of that task. So just like the PTS, they can always add extra tasks if they want, or extra elements within a task. But unlike the PTS, you're getting a lot more guidance on what those options could be. So you can be using this to be a study guide for not only the practical, but also the written or knowledge test. And then when you miss any pieces on that knowledge test, you'll get very precise guidance on exactly what you'll be asked, at least some of which, exactly what you'll be asked to cover in the practical test itself. So here we're going to go through an example. Let's say that the knowledge test report had missed a question PHVIICK1. Now that becomes a required knowledge element. So the DPE may select the following. One knowledge element, and they use the required one that you'd missed, so that could be the K1. One risk element. So they're now going to pick, say, R2 distractions, and they'll try to give you a scenario-based distraction. And of course, all of the skills. That doesn't change. But like I said, they can always ask more, especially if when asking questions there appears to be some weakness that often invites deeper questioning and more elements to be covered. So you may be thinking, well, I just took a knowledge test prior to May 31st, and I have the old PLT codes, but my check ride is going to be in the new ACS system. How's that going to work? The FAA have a document called the AC What's New and What's Next, and it suggests a solution to this, which is to perform a word search in the ACS to match the PLT codes. Sometimes that works. like PLT067, interpret information on a SIGMET. So if you search for SIGMET, that can give you some ACS codes that would match. Sometimes not so. Here, 1927 is Coriolis effect. Okay, let's talk about the just document structure itself, how the ACS is structured differently than the PTS. Again, this is just the general rule across all the ACS. First of all, a lot of the intro content and lengthy task notes that used to be in the PTS have been moved into 3 appendices. Appendix 1 covers practical test roles, responsibilities, and outcomes. Appendix 2 is focused on safety of flight. And Appendix 3 is aircraft, equipment, and operational requirements and limitations. There's also a separate document called the ACS Companion Guide for Pilots. If you buy the paper version of these, the printed version of any of these ACS, you get the companion guide as part of that usually. So we'll look briefly at the Helicopter Private PTS as an example here. Looking at the introduction material, and you can see that some of that's going to be moved into the companion guide. Some of it's moved into a short forward at the front of the ACS. This section here, talking about use of the words should and may, has been moved into the companion guide. And this little piece here about where you can get the copies of the PTS has also been moved into the forward section. This bit here in this particular example is talking about the combined private and instrument check ride, and that will be put into the Appendix 1. Here we're now looking at the practical test standards concept, the blurb that again is at the start of the PTS, and that's been moved into the Appendix 1, which is covering the section on the use of ACS during a practical test, as well as some pieces put into the short introduction of the ACS. Here we have the references that would be used in the practical test standard. They've all been moved and updated to the ACS Companion Guide for Pilots. You can see here there's quite a list. You could use this as a study guide, and you could mark these that are relevant for each rating and give yourself, if you print them off, and then just give yourself a tick for those that you've read. That's probably a good tip. Now we're looking at the table of contents for the old practical test standard for the Helicopter Private. So you can see here the sections on general information, practical test book descriptions, use of practical test standards, the test prerequisites, flight instructor and examiner responsibilities, SAT and unsat performance, letter of discontinuance, and additional rating tables. All of that's been moved into the Appendix 1 of the ACS. Here we can see the ADM and risk management, the single pilot resource management or SRM, the applicant's use of checklists, distractions, and positive exchange of controls. All of those have been moved into Appendix 2, which is safety of flight. And some of those have also been blended into specific task elements. Here, the task versus simulation device credit, that's been moved into Appendix 3 and changed slightly. That's under the aircraft equipment and operational requirements limitations. Abbreviations and the practical test checklist have been moved or changed to the companion guide again. Here you can see the practical test checklist, the new one for the ACS. Special emphasis areas, ADM, single pilot resource, and the checklist, like I said, has not only been put into Appendix 2 Safety of Flight, it's also going to be spread throughout the ACS to the task-specific elements that are relevant. Other ratings have extra items, like the instrument has the Judgment Assessment Matrix, the CFI PTS had the Renewal of CFI Certificate. Both of those will be covered in the deep dive videos that go into those ratings. But again, a lot of it's been moved or simplified or consolidated. The examiner's practical test checklist has been removed from the ACS and is now in a document called ACS Tips for Evaluators. That's actually got some interesting pieces in there that you might find useful as an instructor, or especially a stage check instructor. It covers a lot about scenario-based training and a scenario-based assessment. It gives some really good examples of what they call trigger points to insert into your stage checks. Now here we're going to compare a private helicopter PTS area of operations just quickly against the helicopter ACS. There's obviously some formatting and name changes. You've already seen that vortex ring state, which used to be setting with power. There's some reordering. There's no additional items in this specific example. There are in some of the other certificates or the other ACSs that we'll talk about. This full details of all this stuff is what we'll be covering in the future videos of each individual ACS. Now here's an example from the commercial Helicopter ACS, and here is an example of 2 brand new tasks. This is a bit of a big deal. It's asking us to do flight solely by reference to instruments and recovery from unusual flight attitudes in the commercial practical tests. A lot of people, a lot of flight schools, they're doing their commercial check rides in an R22, for example, typically without an attitude indicator. So this is going to be a bit of a problem for schools like that now have to get some sort of attitude indicator installed on those aircraft, or they're going to have to do a little bit of the check ride perhaps in an R44 and then do the rest of the check ride in the R22. There's also an option if you have a simulator that's the right level, an FDT, that could be worked to be used as a for the instrument part of the check ride. These 2 elements are also included in the CFI ACS, but they are optional. They're not necessarily going to be chosen by the examiner, whereas these are required elements. More on that in the commercial ACS deep dive video. Some other parts of the ACS document that's changed. There is a table of contents that's now hyperlinked, so you can jump straight to that section. They've also, like we already said, some new and updated references, and those are task-specific references. You can see here a good example of the old PTS. Just had a couple of references for airworthiness, and the new ACS has a lot more references there for you. We already sort of talked about the special emphasis areas in ADM being changed. Those special emphasis areas, there was usually a list at the start of the PTS. That's gone, so is the judgment assessment matrix from the instrument, and the 6 separate SRM ADM items that kind of looked like a task, but they weren't really a task, that was at the start of the instrument. That stuff's gone. Here's an example of, again, the private pilot helicopter PTS versus the new ACS. You can see here we have some of the sections in that special emphasis area: collision avoidance, wake turbulence, runway incursion, CFIT, wire strike. Those are being fed into risk management sections throughout the tasks. Checklist usage is also another one that's spread throughout the flight tasks. ADM and risk management. Again, we've got our own risk management section. There's also a human, for example, in the private pilot, there's a human factors task that has some knowledge items related to ADM, CRM, and SRM. There's also what's called flight deck management. That's a task that's in the private, commercial, and the CFI. That has this special note. It's kind of like a special rule. It says see Appendix 2. We'll talk about that in a second. The procedures for positive exchange of flight controls, instead of being in a special emphasis, it's under the safety of flight appendix. Also, that ADM and risk management is mentioned, and SR, single pilot resource management, is mentioned, along with the checklists. All of that is in the safety of flight. Now, we said that note, that special rule regarding the flight deck. So what it says here is, if an applicant fails to use aeronautical decision-making ADM, including SRM or CRM, as applicable in any task, the evaluator will note that that task has failed. The evaluator will also include the ADM skill element from the flight deck management task on the notice of disapproval of application. So you get a bonus fail. That's not in the instrument, but it is in the private, commercial, and CFI. So you'll have 2 tasks to deal with there. As we already said, the instrument ACS, there's no note on the Appendix 2 about the additional failed flight deck management task. That task doesn't exist in the instrument ACS. There's strangely no mention of ADM or human factors in task elements, or most of them, but there is in the instrument SRM and CRM skill elements in most flight tasks. The instrument ACS kind of feels like it was built by a different team. There's some inconsistencies between the private, commercial, and CFI. Now, obviously, spin, stall, awareness, that's regarding this PTS was written as an airplane and helicopter one, the instrument one that we're looking at here on the left, so that didn't apply to the helicopters. The land and hold short operations did, and that's another strange one, is that it was taken out of the special emphasis areas. Obviously don't exist anymore, they've been blended into the ACS, but I couldn't find land and hold short operations anywhere in any of the ACS. And again, we'll go through the full instrument ACS in its own video in a deep dive and really get into all the different tasks. Now, special emphasis areas in ADM, the other thing I want to talk about is that the Risk Management Handbook, which is the 8083-2, is referenced pretty much, I think, on all tasks, which kind of makes sense because all tasks now have a risk management section in them. Checklist usage is also blended through all the flight skills, but they also acknowledge in Appendix 2, which is the Safety of Flight Appendix, that it's not always safe and practical to pull out a checklist in flight, and instead the pilot's expected to use memory items. Other ADM in specific tasks, things like distractions, loss of situational awareness, radio calls, wind direction, collision hazards, including wires and runway incursions, they've all been pushed into individual elements of risk management and skills as they relate to specific tasks. Let's talk about the new technologies that are being kind of put into the check rides now for flight, etc. So the K for knowledge, the risk, and the skill elements have a lot of references to EFBs, electronic flight bags, kind of like a for-flight type of thing. There's also reference to things like cockpit in-flight weather, TISB, for example. And they've removed old weather product requirements and added the new graphical weather products, for example, the GFA. So these are being updated with modern technology. The other thing is that a lot of these, if it's installed equipment or if you're using an EFB, it's fair game for the examiner to kind of quiz you on its use. So make sure you know how to use this stuff. They've also been updating the references, so they are getting rid of old references like the old weather reference, the old weather ACs, and adding the new weather handbook amongst other things. There are some strange pieces here and there where there's certain elements that refer to LTE, but they don't refer to the AC on uncontrolled yaw. So it's not all inclusive. There's still a few pieces missing here and there, in my opinion. The full list of resources has been moved to the ACS companion guide. I've put it as ACG. I don't know if anyone else will call it that, but that's what I've been using it. So that's, like I said, that's a good thing to perhaps print that list off and mark the ones that you think that you want to cover for the particular check ride and knowledge test that you're going to be working on, and then tick them off once you've kind of studied those, like a study guide list. The additional ratings tables, there's been some changes to these as well. They've added a legend to explain what the different headers are. They've done some combined category class stuff. They've put in powered lift. There has been changes of tasks required, which we could cover again in each individual ACS. We'll kind of cover that in a bit more detail. But here's an example. Here on the left is the private pilot PTS, and on the right the helicopter ACS for the same rating. You can see there's an added legend now. Powered lift has been added. The two glider categories have been combined. And then we can see there's a bunch of changes here. Some of them are about reordering of tasks, some renumbering or relettering of tasks, but there are some changes still. So this was the first in a series of videos. This is the kind of the general starter video that will tell you about the big differences between ACS that's common across all of the ACS. And then we're going to kind of deep dive into the private commercial instrument and CFI and really look at how the tasks have changed and what the individual elements are that are different and what you need to be thinking about. We'll also talk about what's been removed, what's been changed, changes to references, what you need to be studying, and any changes to standards. So far, I haven't seen, in terms of objective numbers, I haven't seen many changes. I do think I've seen a spot where they talked about a change in the target airspeed in autos for the private rating, but for the most part, it seems that the standard numbers have remained the same. Okay, so tips for students. Well, first of all, and for examiners and instructors, this will be better. It's going to be a little bit getting used to, but we're going to get a lot more information and guidance in these documents. We can also use the ACS to really check your required knowledge. You go through all of these tasks and ask yourself, do I know this stuff? And if I don't, I need to get with my instructor and go through this, or I need to do some studying. And that's for the knowledge tests as well as the practical. Whereas in the past, we really only used the PTS for the practical test prep. This is also for the knowledge test prep now. Another tip is don't skip the appendices and make sure you read that companion guide. Those are kind of required reading. And do your very best on those knowledge tests. Don't just settle for a pass. Because remember, the higher the score, essentially that's going to mean a quicker and easier check ride, or it should do if you know your stuff. And then when they come out, hopefully in the next week or so, get into those deep dive videos. We'll give you the specifics on the individual ratings, the private commercial instrument and CFI. Now, these are just some of the changes. If you think of something that I've missed, or you think there's something that we haven't given enough effort to talk about, please let us know in the comments. And last thing we're going to cover is where you can get some more information. Here's the link to the playlist for those videos. Also the Airmen Certification Standards. The links for all these will be in the description if they don't work on the screen for you. The ACS Companion Guide, a short wings course on ACS, the PTS codes list, which hopefully you won't need anymore once you get past, as long as you get your written done in the new format. Also the ACS tips for evaluators. And then finally, there's links to the book versions or the paper versions of the new ACS. They're affiliate links to Amazon. So if you use those, it means that the project Helicopter Training Videos gets a little bit of support from Amazon, and it costs nothing extra to yourself. Thanks for listening. I know it wasn't the most exciting one, but if you have any comments or questions, put them down in the comments section, and see you next time. If you want more helicopter training videos, check out our Helicopter Ground School series or the Helicopter Flight Maneuver series. Or perhaps you want to follow along with a student from day one all the way through to their check ride with our full flight lesson series. And if you haven't already, please click subscribe to get all the latest videos and help promote the channel. And finally, for more information on helicopter training videos, including articles, resources, quizzes and more, and learn how to support this volunteer project, check out our website, helicoptertrainingvideos.com. Thanks for watching.